The speaker is a marine biologist who became interested in the strandloopers, an ancient people who lived on the coastline, because of their connection to the sea. Their way of life intrigued him. As a child he had spent a lot of time by the sea, exploring and collecting things, so he began to study them, and discovered some interesting information about their way of life, how they hunted, what tools they used, and so on. Lincoln's apparently radical change of mind about his war power to emancipate slaves was caused by the escalating scope of war, which convinced him that any measure to weaken the Confederacy and strengthen the Union war effort was justifiable as a military necessity. In 1861, Matthew Brady, a well-known portrait photographer, approached President Lincoln requesting permission to move freely about the country photographing the Civil War. Lincoln granted him permission to travel anywhere with the Union armies, and his record of this conflict brought home to millions the horrors of war. Britain, then, was slower to create and develop a police force than the rest of Europe. France had one long before, indeed, the word police is taken from the French. This fact was not unimportant, as the very idea of a police force was seen as foreign, that is, French, and particularly undesirable, and was generally regarded as a form of oppression. To understand the past you have to be able, as far as possible, to think as the people in the period you are studying thought. The example of what it must have been like to be a peasant in the Middle Ages issued. However, sensibilities change over time and we can't completely throw off the mentality of the present. Therefore, every age will have a slightly different perspective on the same period of the past, no matter what the facts are. We've outfitted it with the space lab built by our European partners and used it before the era of the space station to do scientific research. We used it as part of our partnership with the Russians, which is still continuing, first as part of the Mir space station, where we actually prolonged the useful life of Mir by several years through logistical supply visits with the shuttle. And now, of course, we're using it to build the new International Space Station, which is a huge international partnership. The speaker reminisces about his views of the English Revolution when he was a student and how it seemed quite clear which side he was on, the aristocrats, not the Puritans. Later, he realized there was more to it than that, and there were several ways of interpreting the revolution, as a struggle between the king and parliament, as a class war, or as an unpredictable situation without clear sides. By this time, however, paleontological momentum had moved to England. In 1812, at Lyme Regis on the Dorset coast, an extraordinary child named Mary Anning, aged 11, 12 or 13, depending on whose account you read, found a strange fossilized sea monster, 17 feet long and now known as the Ichthyosaurus, embedded in the steep and dangerous cliffs along the English Channel. The main difference on this occasion was that the colonists were not just fighting against a king who was determined to use his own prerogative. They were also fighting against a parliament which believed that it and it alone should raise taxes and control revenues, rights which had been won in the previous century. In the past, wars have led to inflation and higher commodity prices. Fighting disrupts trade and prevents raw materials from being shipped from one country to another. In Second World War Britain, a banana was the height of luxury. In the summer of 2006, Europe experienced drought on an unprecedented scale. On the Rhine, Europe's busiest waterway, low waters forced ships to carry less cargo and make up for lost revenue with surcharges of up to 50%. In Italy, the Agricultural Confederation announced that the grape harvest was the lowest in 2 decades. Before the time of Alexander the Great, the only Eastern people who could be compared with the Greeks in the fields of science and philosophy were from the Indian subcontinent. However, because so little is known about Indian chronology, it is difficult to tell how much of their science was original and how much was the result of Greek influence. In the second quarter of the 19th century, a rapidly growing middle class created a great demand for furniture production. Yet at this stage, while machines were used for certain jobs, such as carved decoration, there was no real mass production. The extra demand was met by numerous woodworkers. Mass production came later and the quality of domestic furniture declined. Line engraving on metal, which, to a great extent, was a development of the goldsmith's craft of ornamenting armor and precious metals, did not emerge as a printmaking technique until well into the 151th century. Copper, the metal mainly used for engraving, was expensive, and engraving itself was laborious and took a long time. For the first 2 or 3 years after the Second World War, a new title would often sell out within a few months of publication. However, unless public demand for the book was unusually high, they were rarely able to reprint it. With paper stock strictly rationed, they could not afford to use up precious paper or tie up their limited capital with a reprint.